Kuhn's book argues that the evolution of scientific theory does not emerge from the straightforward accumulation of facts, but rather from a set of changing intellectual circumstances and possibilities. Such an approach is largely commensurate with the general historical school of nonlinear history. He did not see scientific theory as proceeding linearly with an objective in mind and an unbiased accumulation of all available data, but rather as paradigm-driven. The operations and measurements that a scientist undertakes in the laboratory are not the given of the experience, but rather the collected with difficulty. They are not what the scientist sees, at least not before his research is well advanced and his attention focused. Rather, they are concrete indices to the content of more elementary perceptions. And as such, they are selected for the close scrutiny of normal research, only because they promise opportunity for the fruitful elaboration of an accepted paradigm, far more clearly than the immediate experience from which they in part derive. Operations and measurements are paradigm determined. Science does not deal in all possible laboratory manipulations. Instead, it selects those relevant for the juxtaposition of a paradigm with the immediate experience that last paradigm has partially determined. As a result, scientists with different paradigms engage in different concrete laboratory manipulations. Kuhn uses an example from science to explain this idea. Chemists used to believe that homogeneous solutions were simply chemical compounds. For instance, a combination of water and alcohol was generally classified as a compound. We know today it's a solution, but there was no reason back then to suspect it was not a compound. Water and alcohol, when they are mixed together, does not separate spontaneously, nor can you ever separate them completely, even with very intense distillation. They can also be combined in any proportion. One of the aims of science is to find models that will account for as many observations as possible within a coherent framework. According to Kuhn, once a paradigm shift has taken place, the textbooks are rewritten. Often the history of science too is rewritten, being presented as an inevitable process leading up to the current established framework of thought. As a paradigm is stretched to its limits, anomalies, failures of the current paradigm to take into account absurd phenomena, accumulate. Some of these anomalies may simply be dismissed as errors in observation, others are merely requiring very small adjustments of the current paradigm to be classified as due course. However, in any community, according to Kuhn, there are individuals who are bolder than others. These scientists see that a crisis exists, and they embark on what Kuhn calls a revolutionary science. They explore alternatives to long-held obvious-seeming assumptions. Occasionally, this generates a rival to the established framework of thought. According to Kuhn, the process of scientific development is simply various phases of paradigm changes. Phase 1. It exists only once and is the pre-paradigm phase, in which there is no consensus on any particular theory. This phase is characterized by several incompatible and incomplete theories. Consequently, most scientific inquiry takes the form of lengthy books, as there is no common body of facts that may be taken for granted. If the actors in the pre-paradigm community eventually gravitate to one of these conceptual frameworks and ultimately to a widespread consensus on the appropriate choice of methods, terminology, and on the kinds of experiments that are likely to contribute to increased insights. Phase 2. Normal science begins, in which puzzles are solved within the context of the dominant paradigm. As long as there is consensus within the discipline, normal science continues. Over time, progress in normal science may reveal anomalies, facts that are difficult to explain within the context of the existing paradigm. While usually these anomalies are resolved, in some cases they may accumulate to the point where normal science becomes difficult and where weaknesses in the old paradigm are revealed. Phase 3. If the paradigm proves chronically unable to account for anomalies, the community enters a crisis period. Crises are often resolved within the context of normal science. However, after significant efforts of normal science within a paradigm fail, science may enter the next phase. Phase 4, paradigm shift or scientific revolution, is the phase in which the underlying assumptions of the field are re-examined and a new paradigm is established. Phase 5, post-revolution. The new paradigm's dominance is established, and so scientists return to normal science, solving puzzles within the new paradigm. A science may go through these cycles repeatedly, though Kuhn notes that it is a good thing for science that such shifts do not occur often or easily. Now that we understand Kuhn better and his thoughts about science, we can finally get on with my actual essay. The confirmation of heliocentrism is probably Galileo Galilei's most noticeable contribution to the scientific community. But he did encounter a large resistance, not just famously from the Catholic Church, but also from some other astronomers. These astronomers' resistance to heliocentrism, and especially the Copernican model, was based on the fact that they had not yet observed a phenomena called parallax regarding the Sun. Today, we know it simply has to do with the size of the Sun and other heavenly bodies. But back in the year of 1613, Galileo documented a finding which definitively outcompeted previous geocentric models. What he found was that Venus goes through phases, like our moon. This is a phenomena which is fundamentally incompatible with the idea that Venus is orbiting the Earth and not the Sun. In other words, in order for this phenomena to even be observed, Venus has to orbit the Sun and not the Earth. The modus operandi of Galileo was to experiment by using and formulating mathematical descriptions for movements, and later derive experiments after them. This is very similar to the physics we have today, in the sense that the philosophy of physics is reductionist in its nature. Mathematical models to explain phenomena, but primarily and desirably to formulate formulas to be able to predict said phenomena, is generally the goal of every area of physics. There are complications where this is very hard to achieve, but despite this, the goal of all areas of physics is generally to be able to reduce phenomena to their constituents. However, any hypothesis that relies on models must also be able to be tested without mercy through empirical experiments. Charles Darwin is probably the biologist who has made the most famous contribution to biology. His most famous expedition was to the Galapagos Islands outside of Ecuador's coast in the year of 1835. It was, for example, here that he made his infamous observations of the finks with their different beaks on different islands, and as he noted how they seemed to be perfectly adapted for what the finks had specialized within, this probably helped him later on develop his ideas of natural selection. However, it was not until over 2 decades later that he publicized his book, Origins of Species. Much like Galileo, in the beginning he encountered a lot of resistance from both the church and from many other biologists. Many of those biologists were themselves religious. The cause of his uproar was simple. His ideas about how life evolved autonomously without any kind of need of any kind of interference from a higher order collided with the idea that life was too complicated to be able to explain with natural processes. But Darwin did succeed, roughly, to explain life's development with natural selection. This process basically means that organisms within species show a variation for something or some characteristics, and that organisms whose characteristics are more suited for its environment will probably also survive long enough until they have an offspring. These characteristics are inherited by the new generation through a, well, for Darwin at the time, unknown mechanism. Darwin also succeeded in doing breeding experiments which confirmed his ideas about how certain characteristics are inherited, and also how these characteristics tend to be the ones that are the least inconvenient for the species' success. Darwin's ideas was eventually, after a rocky start, publicly accepted and confirmed by other biologists through independent experiments. The fact is that just like how the Earth is round may not make sense for some isolated tribe in a rainforest, it doesn't really make sense either how life can evolve practically unnoticeably slow over generation cumulatively to eventually end up as a new species long after a human lifetime. For a person that has grown up in an age where the calculations of the Earth's true age was billions of years away from being correct. But this is where Darwin dazzled with brilliance in biology. Biology is in many ways non-reducible. The system is what is of interest in the most fields of biology. Even in the more reductionist fields like genetics or molecular biology, all observations and experiments are actually in a way related to the organism, which is fundamentally a system capable of reproducing on its own will. Both Darwin and Galileo gave rise to their respective revolutions, but today their findings and ideas are considered normal sciences, according to Kuhn. The question then is, why should we even acknowledge, for instance, geocentrism when all its credibility has been exhausted? The corpse is not going to come back to life, so why bother digging it up and try to have a discussion when the conversation is going to be entirely one-sided and its cranium is just going to come loose and fall down on the podium? First, the new candidate must seem to resolve some outstanding and generally recognized problem that can be met in no other way. Second, the new paradigm must promise to preserve a relatively large part of the concrete problem-solving activity that has accrued to science through its predecessors. Much like Kuhn described, both geocentrism and evolutionary theory lives up to these criteria. As Kuhn described, the reconstruction of science's previous paradigms also makes scientific history from a modern perspective look like a purely cumulative and relatively linear experience. Thereby, you're actually hiding revolutions in these mirages. He argues also that researchers themselves risk engaging with this romanticized view when it comes to their own research. Making these previous revolutions invisible is not even a conscious process, in other words. In this way, you could perhaps argue that course books and other academic literature gives a false impression to not just researchers, but also to students and the public about how science actually operates. Maybe this is a necessary thing, as you have to ask yourself, if you are going to teach a novice about, for instance, inertia or the gravitational constant, is it really relevant to bring up the entire history behind mechanics? Or is it perhaps only pertinent to mention how Newton developed his laws of the movement of objects? To give significant examples to make an area more easily understood is a pedagogic principle which is very effective. And too many complications in the start only gives confusion to any student. Should students at a higher level and researchers have the actual complicated scientific history in mind? Yes. But the simple truth of the matter is, that complicated history just isn't really relevant to doing your research day in and day out. Thereby, a normalization, making the past invisible in a sense, may actually be necessary. Thank you all for watching this video version of my essay. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you guys. Take care. Bye.